Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Take a moment and think about how much you trust the technology that guides your everyday life. From the GPS routing you around traffic to those maybe eerily accurate online shopping recommendations, even the smart home devices anticipating your next move. How often do you just sort of assume the system knows best? That little glowing screen, that confident voice, it
Yeah.
must be right.
Well, it's a completely natural human tendency, really. We rely on these systems because, look, for the most part, they work exceptionally well. They genuinely make our lives easier, more convenient, and, yeah, often more efficient.
And that's precisely why today we're taking a deep dive into a truly fascinating and I think increasingly critical concept, automation bias. At its core, it's our human tendency to, well, favor suggestions from automated decision-making systems, and crucially, to ignore contradictory information even when that automated advice is flat out wrong. It's subtle, it's powerful, and it's becoming an even more pervasive force as artificial intelligence weaves itself deeper, into the very fabric of our daily lives.
Right. And this isn't just some uh, theoretical or futuristic concept about robots taking over. Not at all.
Yeah.
It's about the very real, very complex interplay happening right now between human judgment and automated systems.
Yeah.
And it's happening in areas that are absolutely crucial, areas where the stakes can be incredibly high.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to unpack its roots in high-risk fields like aviation and medicine, where the concept first really emerged. Then we'll explore its surprisingly vital and far-reaching implications across the public sector, national security, and even those everyday decisions that impact you directly. We've pulled together some incredible systematic reviews and some really groundbreaking studies that offer a truly comprehensive look at this phenomenon. Think of it as giving you a shortcut to understanding this hidden current.
Absolutely. Our mission in this deep dive is basically to equip you with a nuanced understanding of automation bias. So what it is, why it happens, where it shows up, and I think most importantly, how we can all become more vigilant, more informed decision makers in this increasingly automated world. We want you to walk away from this deep dive with, well, tools to critically assess the information automated systems provide, and maybe even to advocate for better, more responsible AI.
So with that kind of foundational understanding of what automation bias is, let's peel back the layers. Let's explore where this fascinating and, yeah, sometimes frightening phenomenon has been most keenly observed in the real world. Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start with the basics then. What exactly is automation bias? It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but it's very much a documented psychological reality, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, at its most distilled, automation bias is essentially our human over-reliance on automated systems. And that could be computer hardware, software, complex algorithms, you name it, to make decisions. And this over-reliance occurs even when the machine-generated output is incorrect or, directly contradicts our own human judgment. It's not just a hypothetical error we might make. It's a well-documented human tendency. It's been observed for decades now, really, in all sorts of contexts.
So it's not just about trusting the machine, but actively letting it override our own intuition, or even available evidence that's right there in front of us. That sounds almost, well, irrational. Are we really that easily swayed, even with contradictory data?
You've really hit on a core aspect there. The idea is that we can agree with these automated recommendations without fully analyzing accessible information that would, in fact, disprove them. Or, maybe even more insidiously, we might miss critical issues entirely simply because the automated system didn't flag them. It didn't bring them to our attention. Skitka and colleagues highlighted this back in their foundational work from the late 90s. They emphasize that we fall prey to this even when we know intellectually that the automated aid isn't 100% accurate. We just sort of tend to assume correctness until proven otherwise. And often, let's be honest, we don't actively seek out that proof.
And where did this concept first emerge? Was it always tied to these high-tech systems we see today, or did it start somewhere else?
It really emerged from human factors research back in the 1990s. It was predominantly focusing on high-risk environments. Think about the cockpit of an airplane. Early studies frequently look at scenarios involving complex autopilot systems. Skipke and colleagues conducted some seminal experiments in the 90s and early 2000s. In these simulations, participants, and this included experienced pilots, would interact with automated aids. These aids sometimes provided incorrect information or failed to alert them to critical events, and they consistently observed automation bias. Despite knowing the aid wasn't infallible, participants would miss events the autopilot didn't warn them about. Or they'd follow the aid's incorrect suggestions, even when they had other conflicting information right there. What's particularly interesting and maybe a bit counterintuitive is that these participants often didn't report feeling less challenged by the task when using the automated aid, even though they were demonstrably offloading significant cognitive effort. Mosier and colleagues found these same results applied even to experienced pilots back in '98, reinforcing just how robust this phenomenon is.
Huh. So it's not just about feeling less challenged, but a fundamental shift in how we process information and respond to alerts, or maybe the lack of alerts. You mentioned two types of errors that can result from this bias. Can you elaborate on those? It sounds like automation bias can sneak up on us in quite different ways.
Indeed. It manifests in two primary ways, which makes it quite insidious in its effects. First, we have errors of omission. This happens when a human operator fails to notice or act upon an issue, simply because the automated system did not bring it to their attention. It's a critical blind spot created by the absence of an alert or a prompt from the system. For instance, imagine a scenario in a spacecraft life support system simulation. Bonner and colleagues studied this back in 2008. Participants were informed that the automated decision support system, the ADSS, could potentially miss some issues. Now, while this knowledge did help reduce those errors of omission, participants were a bit more likely to spot problems. The ADSS overlooked it, had no effect on reducing the second type of error, which are commission errors. This suggests that humans don't necessarily generalize. One type of system failure doesn't automatically make us suspect other types of failures. We seem to compartmentalize our trust, perhaps.
That's fascinating. So even if we know a system has one specific flaw, like missing things, we might not assume it has others, like giving bad advice. It sounds like our brains are almost too good at compartmentalizing trust, maybe? How does that compare to the second type of error you mentioned, the errors of commission? Is one more common or maybe more dangerous?
The second type is errors of commission. This is when a human operator actively follows an incorrect suggestion from an automated system. Crucially, they do this even when they possess readily available evidence that directly contradicts that suggestion. So it's actively choosing to follow the machine into error, despite your own senses or data telling you otherwise. A striking and frankly very concerning example comes from a 2004 radiology study by Alberti and colleagues. They were focusing on cancer detection. Radiologists who typically had an impressive 80% accuracy rate working independently saw their accuracy plummet to a mere 53% when the ADSS provided incorrect assistance.
Wow, that's a huge drop.
It's enormous. Imagine the profound danger here. Radiologists potentially missing crucial signs of cancer because the ADSS gave a flawed opinion. This really highlights how susceptible even highly skilled professionals can be, and the devastating real-world impact of blindly following flawed automated advice, especially when the stakes are so incredibly high for patient health. Both error types are dangerous, of course, but commission errors can feel more active somehow as you're making a conscious choice to follow wrong advice.
That's truly terrifying, honestly. It just underscores why understanding this phenomenon is so vital across so many fields. So if we know it can be so dangerous, why do we fall into this trap? What are the underlying psychological reasons that make us so susceptible to automation bias?
Well, there are several theories that try to unpack the why behind it, exploring our human nature and how we interact with technology. One significant factor is our innate propensity to trust technology. Automated systems often carry the sort of aura of infallibility, right? Or at the very least, they're perceived as more reliable and objective than fallible human judgment. This happens because, well, complex algorithms and AI are often associated with precision, expertise, objective data processing, leading us to a default, almost unconscious assumption of correctness. It's almost an automatic deference to the machine.
I can definitely relate to that. When Google Maps tells me to turn left, I don't usually pull out a paper map to double check, Even if it sometimes sends me down a questionable alley, it's just easier to trust it.
And you're definitely not alone. It's a testament to how convenient and generally effective these systems are, and how quickly we adapt to relying on them. The challenge, of course, comes when that convenience masks a critical error, and that leads directly to the next theory. Cognitive laziness, or what some researchers call cognitive offloading. This theory basically posits that humans actively use automated aids as mental shortcuts, effectively offloading cognitive effort onto the machine. It's our natural tendency to, well, allow the machine to do the thinking for them, particularly when we're under heavy workloads, tight deadlines, or simply when the task feels inherently complex. It's efficient until it's not. Skicka and colleagues back in 2000 concluded that this tendency towards cognitive laziness was likely a primary explanation for why automation bias occurs so readily.
So we're essentially taking the path of least resistance mentally, especially when we're stressed or busy. That makes perfect sense. What about multitasking? I've heard that contributes to errors with automation too.
That's a good point, and the research here has actually evolved a bit.
Initially, researchers like Molloy and Parasuraman back in '96 suggested that multitasking could directly cause errors. The idea was humans become overloaded and miss automated system errors. However, later systematic reviews, like one by Lyell and Coyera in 2017, found something more nuanced and perhaps more pervasive. They observed that automation bias was present even in single-task experiments. This indicated that it wasn't just the act of multitasking that mattered. Instead, the inherent task complexity seemed to be the more significant factor. When a task is inherently difficult, requiring significant cognitive resources, our reliance on the automated system tends to increase, even if we're not juggling other tasks simultaneously.
Interesting. So it's not just about having too many balls in the air, but maybe how hard it is to juggle even one. That's a crucial distinction.
Precisely. And another significant contributing factor is the phenomenon of anchoring to automated suggestions. This describes how our human decisions can be unduly influenced if the automated decision support system, the ADSS, gives its advice before we make our own initial judgment. Jisipao and colleagues in 2021 found this with physicians, for example. They were more heavily influenced by ADSS advice when they received it first. It basically anchored their subsequent assessment to the system's suggestion. It can be incredibly difficult for our brains to unanchor from that initial recommendation, even if we subsequently uncover contradictory evidence. It's a bit like that first number you hear in a negotiation. It kind of sets the stage for all subsequent thinking.
Right, frames everything else. And finally, you mentioned complacency. Is that the same thing as automation bias, or are they maybe two sides of the same coin?
They are very, very closely linked, often described as sister concepts or maybe different manifestations of the same underlying tendency. Parasuraman and Mansi, in their influential 2010 work, explain that automation bias is intimately connected to complacency. Complacency in this context is where a user, sort of as a general rule, simply accepts ADSS suggestions without critical evaluation. It's a reduced vigilance, an unquestioning acceptance of automated outputs. So while automation bias describes the specific error of favoring automated suggestions, complacency describes the broader habitual state of reduced human vigilance because of the presence of automation. They often reinforce each other, leading to the sort of continuum of overreliance.
So we've talked about the origins in aviation, but I know this phenomenon isn't confined to cockpits. Where else has automation bias been studied, and what have we learned about its prevalence and effects in other critical domains?
Indeed, the research has expanded significantly, especially into healthcare, which has really become a critical frontier for studying automation bias, mainly due to the potential life and death consequences involved. Beyond radiology, which we touched on earlier with that Alberti study, Jisipao in 2021 found an interesting nuance. Experienced physicians were actually more likely to disregard correct ADSS advice than novices were.
Really? That seems backwards.
It does seem counterintuitive, right? But it hints at the value of experience in fostering a healthy skepticism. Perhaps it allows them to better discern when to trust and when to question, even if that sometimes means dismissing advice that turned out to be accurate. It suggests a more nuanced interaction than just simple trust or distrust.
That's a good reminder that experience can be a powerful moderator, but maybe not always in the way we expect. So when it goes wrong, how does automation bias manifest specifically in healthcare settings today, particularly with the rise of AI?
Hassanzadeh and colleagues, in their very recent 2025 research, define automation bias in healthcare AI specifically as the inappropriate user adoption of inaccurate AI predictions. It manifests through those omission and commission errors we discussed earlier, and it's often exacerbated in the fast-paced, high-pressure clinical environments where quick decisions are paramount. They also highlight that bias in this context is any systematic and/or unfair difference in how predictions are generated for different patient populations that could lead to disparate care delivery. So this means it's not just about simple mistakes, it's about potential inequities and a widening of health disparities for vulnerable groups.
Can you give us a more concrete example in healthcare, something that really brings the danger home, showing how it can affect actual patient outcomes?
Certainly. Dratch and colleagues in 2023 studied automation bias in mammography screening, which is obviously a crucial tool for early cancer detection. They found that radiologist reporting accuracy dropped significantly when AI suggested an incorrect BIR8S category, that's the standardized system for classifying findings. For inexperienced radiologists, accuracy plummeted from around 80% down to a shocking 19.8% when the AI gave flawed advice.
Wow.
But here's where it gets even more interesting and, frankly, quite alarming. Even very experienced radiologists, who typically started with an accuracy of about 82.3% on their own, saw their accuracy fall dramatically to 45.5% when the AI gave bad advice.
So even the experts were heavily swayed.
Exactly. This vividly demonstrates that even seasoned, highly trained professionals are susceptible to automation bias. It highlights its profound dangers in medical diagnosis, where the smallest error can have life-altering consequences for patients.
That's a stark illustration of how even highly trained human experts can be led astray. It really challenges the idea that just having a human in the loop is some kind of guaranteed safeguard. Beyond healthcare, where else do we see this playing out with real, immediate, and maybe very costly consequences?
We've certainly seen critical impacts in financial services, where the sheer speed and scale of automated systems can amplify human errors stemming from automation bias. A really striking example is the 2012 Knight Capital incident. This was an algorithmic trading firm. Due to a new automated trading program malfunctioning, it unleashed $440 million in bad trades in just 45 minutes. It nearly bankrupted the company.
45 minutes. Incredible.
Yeah. Traders and system operators were either too slow to react or perhaps over-relied on the system's output, despite clearly anomalous behavior. It demonstrates the immediate, incredibly costly dangers of unchecked automation and over-reliance in a high-velocity business context. The human oversight either wasn't there, or maybe it was just overridden by the sheer volume and speed of the system's output.
Unbelievable. That's a massive financial hit in minutes. This truly highlights why this topic isn't just academic. Now let's pivot to an area that I understand hasn't received as much attention as aviation or healthcare in previous reviews, the public sector. What insights does Fanny Danlid's systematic review from 2024 offer here?
Yeah, Danlid's review is critical precisely because, as you said, previous systematic reviews are primarily focused on aviation and healthcare. That left a significant gap in our understanding of automation bias in other crucial domains. Public sector decisions think about welfare services, employment agencies, legal processes, even child welfare hotlines. These profoundly impact citizens' daily lives. So even relatively low levels of automation bias in these domains could be potentially disastrous because, unlike in a competitive market, citizens often have no alternative service providers. Furthermore, some AI techniques can result in what are called black boxes systems, where how a decision was reached is unknown or just too complex for human interpretation. This is particularly problematic in the public sector, as it can hinder a citizen's ability to understand and appeal a decision, raising significant accountability and transparency concerns.
That's a huge point. If you can't understand why a system made a decision about your benefits or employment, how can you ever challenge it effectively? What about the methodology of this review? What kind of studies did it look at?
So, Danlid's 2024 systematic review specifically included 13 recent empirical studies published between 2020 and 2024. This reflects the recent surge in interest and adoption of AI in these areas. These studies cover diverse public sector domains like law, auditing, human resources, education, investments, and fraud detection. Critically, she excluded medicine and military studies to specifically address that research gap in other public-facing services. Due to the wide variety and heterogeneity of the included studies, different tasks, different types of automated systems, different participant groups, a narrative synthesis was used rather than a meta-analysis. This means she looked for common themes and trends rather than just aggregating numerical data. It's also important to note the review was conducted by a single person, and while quality assessments were performed, no studies were excluded based purely on quality criteria, which is a standard practice in some reviews to ensure comprehensive coverage of recent literature.
Okay, got it. And what did the review find about the overall prevalence of automation bias in these public sector domains? Was it as clear-cut as in, say, aviation, where it seems quite pervasive?
Well, this review, unlike some earlier ones focused on those high-risk monitoring tasks, reveals a critical nuance. Automation bias isn't some universal constant, nor is its prevalence uniformly high across all domains. The review actually found mixed conclusions regarding the overall prevalence of automation bias in these public sector contexts. Many studies showed small or even non-significant results, though, importantly, tendencies towards bias were often present. Only 3 out of the 13 studies found statistically significant evidence for automation bias, and 3 actually found no evidence at all. This really highlights the complexity and the context dependency of the phenomenon outside of those traditional, maybe time-pressured human monitoring tasks. It means we can't just apply a one-size-fits-all solution. We really need to understand the specific conditions and task environments that make people susceptible in each domain.
Fascinating. So it's not a universal constant across all domains. That's a really key insight for policymakers and system designers, isn't it? Let's delve into some of the specific findings across these public sector domains. What did they find in law and judgment, an area where human discretion is so vital?
Right. In a study by Agudo and colleagues in 2024, they looked at how automated recommendations influence legal judgments. They found a slight, non-significant tendency toward more bias when automated recommendations were received before a human made their own assessment rather than after. This raises an important question for system design. Does providing automated advice first actually hinder independent human judgment? Their findings indicated that while human performance was negatively impacted by incorrect automated support, it didn't necessarily improve if they received correct automated support first. This suggests that the initial automated recommendation might anchor the human assessment regardless of its accuracy.
So it pulls you towards its conclusion either way.
It seems like it. They even propose that instead of having humans supervise automated systems, perhaps humans should make the primary decisions, and the ADSS should only provide a second opinion or maybe raise awareness of possible human mistakes. That kind of flips the script on how we often think about human-in-the-loop systems.
That's a profound shift in perspective. If the machine's primary role is to be a critical checker, not a lead decision maker, yeah, that changes everything. What about human resources? That's an area many of us interact with, from hiring to performance reviews.
In HR, the findings were quite varied. Alon Barkat and Busuyak in 2023 found no significant difference in hiring decisions when advice came from an algorithm versus a human expert. In fact, interestingly, public sector employees in one of their experiments sometimes showed negative automation bias.
Meaning they distrusted the algorithm.
Exactly. They were more skeptical of the algorithm than of a human expert. This suggests that public awareness of recent AI scandals or failures can sometimes make people overly skeptical of algorithms, leading to a kind of backlash effect. That was certainly an unexpected finding.
A backlash effect. That's truly unexpected. Any other interesting findings in HR, especially maybe regarding experience levels?
Yes, LaCroix and Martin LaCroix in 2022 found that professionals, particularly more experienced recruiters, were surprisingly more negatively affected by inconsistent ADSS recommendations than inexperienced ones.
Huh. Why would that be?
Well, it's counterintuitive to some earlier research suggesting experience might confer resilience. It implies that perhaps experienced individuals are more disrupted when the system they've come to rely on, or at least expect consistency from, turns out to be unreliable. Also in HR, Kupfer and colleagues in 2023 explored mitigation strategies. They found that providing information about potential errors did reduce automation bias, as participants spent more time reviewing information. However, simply informing users of their responsibility for the decision did not significantly reduce automation bias.
Just telling them it's their fault doesn't help.
Apparently not significantly. It highlights that responsibility alone isn't enough to counteract these deep-seated cognitive biases.
That really drives home how complex our interaction with these systems is. Simply being told you're responsible doesn't magically make you immune to cognitive shortcuts. And you mentioned another counterintuitive finding earlier that baffled me. Langer et al. in 2023 showed that telling participants an ADSS could be incorrect actually made them more likely to agree with it rather than less. Their acceptance rate went from 76% to 86% when they were explicitly told it could be wrong. This is a truly fascinating insight into our complex psychological relationship with automation. Why? Why do you think that happens?
It's a remarkable finding, isn't it? One hypothesis is that this honesty, this acknowledgement of fallibility, might paradoxically build a greater sense of trust or maybe rapport with the system. It's almost like when a human admits a potential flaw, it makes them seem more relatable or credible, not less. If an AI system is presented as perfectly infallible, any small deviation might shatter trust completely. But if it admits it can make mistakes, users might feel more in control or feel that they understand its limitations better, leading them to be perhaps more comfortable with its advice, even when it happens to be wrong. It's a really delicate balance between transparency and appropriate trust.
That's astonishing. It's like if you admit it's fallible, people trust it more because they appreciate the honesty, maybe. Wow. How did automation bias fare in auditing?
In auditing, both McKenzie et al. In 2023 and Peters in 2022 found evidence of automation bias. Auditors planned less rigorous activities if automated information was presented as accurate, and more rigorous activities if it was presented as inaccurate. This suggests a general leniency and perhaps less skepticism towards automated input. Auditors, it seems, can be swayed by the system's output to either reduce or increase their own effort. This could potentially lead to missed red flags if the system is flawed but appears accurate on the surface. Peters, 2022, also tentatively suggested that engaging in counter-arguing, where participants are prompted to actively agree or disagree with propositions and provide arguments, showed a positive but non-significant association with reduced automation bias. This suggests that actively forcing engagement with the logic and rationale might help users scrutinize the advice more deeply.
That makes sense. Force yourself to question it actively. What about investments in education? Two very different fields.
Well, Keating and Meisner in 2021 found managers rated ADSS advice as superior to human expert advice, and were more likely to invest when supported by an ADSS. This provides indirect evidence of bias in investment decisions, suggesting a default preference for algorithmic advice in financial strategy. In education, Silly and Chuganova in 2024 found no significant automation bias overall, which is good news in that specific context. However, a concerning finding was that participants were worse at adjusting faulty ADSS predictions compared to faulty human predictions.
Worse at fixing the AI's mistakes.
Yes, this points to humans being potentially poor safeguards against automated errors, even if they aren't blindly following the system. They might not follow it blindly into error, but they seem to struggle to fix it or correct for its errors when it's wrong.
Yeah.
This could lead to persistent, unaddressed issues.
So they might not follow it blindly, but they struggle to fix it when it's wrong.
Okay.
And in the very tangible world of landlords making tenant decisions.
So in 2023, found significant evidence of commission errors with landlords. They tended to rely on system-generated risk scores for potential tenants, ignoring readily available contradictory information that would have actually disproved the score. For instance, high-risk applicants saw about an 86% decrease in acceptance odds when an automated risk score was available, compared to only a 65% decrease when landlords only had access to the underlying information without a synthesized score. This is a clear case of actively following a flawed automated score over tangible, verifiable evidence, potentially leading to discriminatory outcomes for potential tenants.
That's a perfect example of commission error having real-world impact on people's lives and opportunities. And what about fraud detection? That seems like an ideal place for AI, right?
It does seem ideal. However, Schimmer et al., in a 2022 preprint, found a tendency where explainable AI, or XAI, which is designed to make AI decisions more transparent by showing the reasons behind them, actually increased commission errors.
Increased error.
They hypothesized that providing these explanations boosted user trust in the system, which paradoxically led to less vigilance and thus more errors of commission. However, it's really important to note this was a preprint with a small sample size, and Daneled's own robustness analysis suggested removing preprints changed some conclusions. So these results are tentative and definitely require more research to be conclusive. But it does raise an intriguing and concerning possibility that even efforts to improve AI transparency could have unintended negative side effects.
That's a good reminder about the state of some research, particularly in such a rapidly evolving field. Okay, what about studies that looked at automation bias in real-world deployments of these systems outside of lab simulations?
D'Artega and colleagues in 2020 observed that child welfare hotline employees could generally tell when an ADSS was over or underestimating risk. This might be because the employees they studied were experienced and used to the manual processes before the system was implemented, giving them a strong baseline for comparison.
So they had something to compare it to.
Exactly. This raises the critical long-term question, though. How will new employees, without this manual pre-automation experience, react? Will they be as discerning? Their study suggested automation bias doesn't seem to be present in implemented systems in the first few months of deployment, which is a hopeful sign, but maybe it's contingent on that foundational human experience. Similarly, Snow in 2021 observed limited automation bias in social workers, possibly due to their inherently risk-averse behavior and the high-stakes nature of their decisions, making them naturally more vigilant. Daneled's review also noted some connection between simpler tasks and less automation bias, echoing those earlier findings that task complexity is a significant factor in how much we rely on automated systems. Now let's turn to an arena where the stakes truly get higher, dramatically so: national security contexts. Horowitz and Kahn's extensive 2024 study delves into the growing use of AI in national security, military operations intelligence analysis. This raises significant, profound questions about accountability, human control, and the prospect of accidents or unintended escalation when human-machine relationships are literally dealing with life and death issues.
That sounds incredibly important. Where were the research gaps they were trying to fill in this high-stakes domain, and what was unique about their approach?
Well, previous research on automation bias rarely focused specifically on military uses. And existing studies often featured smaller sample sizes that just couldn't capture the diversity of human experience or national contexts. Horwitz and Kahn addressed this head-on by conducting a large-scale survey experiment. They had 9,000 participants across 9 countries, representing a broad range of backgrounds. They used military aircraft identification scenarios, distinguishing enemy from friendly aircraft, to test automation bias in a context where the stakes are profoundly life and death. This added a crucial dimension often missing in other studies.
Okay, a massive scale. And what did they identify as the key drivers of bias in these high-stakes settings? Beyond the general human tendency, were there specific factors that made people more susceptible in this context?
They theorized and demonstrated that the key drivers are primarily experiential factors and attitudinal factors. Experiential factors include an individual's familiarity, their knowledge, and their direct experience with AI systems, basically, how much they've worked with AI before. Attitudinal factors encompass more subjective elements, like their general trust in AI as a concept, their confidence in the specific AI system they're using, and critically, their self-confidence in their own ability to perform the task without the AI. All of these contribute to how much humans ultimately choose to rely on automated machines.
And their findings strongly supported a specific psychological concept, didn't they? The Dunning-Kruger effect, but applied to AI reliance. Can you explain how that plays out in this high-stakes context?
Yes, absolutely. Their study strongly supports a fascinating and, importantly, nonlinear relationship between a person's AI background, meaning their knowledge, familiarity, and experience, and their reliance on automation. It seems to manifest in 3 distinct phases, mirroring what we understand about the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with limited knowledge might overestimate their expertise. So in phase 1, skepticism, those with the lowest AI background are actually slightly more algorithm-averse. They tend to treat AI as unreliable, much like someone with virtually no exposure to a new technology might be immediately skeptical or even fearful of it. Their lack of understanding translates into a cautious, sometimes maybe overly cautious, approach. Distrust of AI is also likely heightened in cases where a system has already experienced some kind of public failure, even if it's usually highly reliable.
Okay, so they haven't learned enough to trust it at all yet, sort of remaining on the sidelines. What happens as their AI background increases just slightly, moving past that initial skepticism?
That leads to phase 2, overconfidence, which Horwitz and Kahn termed the beginner's bubble. As an individual's AI background increases slightly, they've learned just enough to be dangerous. You might say their automation bias actually peaks. These individuals have acquired just enough knowledge to think they understand AI, leading to an inflated sense of confidence in its capabilities. And crucially, a failure to fully recognize its inherent limitations or when it might fail. A perfect real-world example of this is the phenomenon of hallucination in large language models, like ChatGPT confidently listing a non-existent academic citation. The Stack Overflow community, the massive online forum for programmers, actually banned ChatGPT answers for a period due to subtle but frequent inaccuracies. This illustrates a clear, real-world consequence of this beginner's bubble. Users become over-reliant because they believe they grasp the AI, but they don't yet understand its deep complexities or its failure modes.
That's a powerful illustration of the danger there. So just a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing, leading to an unwarranted leap of faith. And what's the final, maybe more desirable phase in this progression?
That's phase 3, balanced reliance. At the highest levels of AI background, individuals become more appropriately reliant on automation. They move beyond that bubble into a more tempered and accurate understanding. They grasp both the immense utility and the inherent limitations of AI, knowing more precisely when to question its outputs and when to trust them. They understand the nuances of how AI works, its strengths and weaknesses, which allows them to integrate it effectively into their decision-making process without blindly deferring to it. It's about finding that sweet spot of informed, critical trust.
Right, finding that sweet spot of informed trust where expertise leads to wisdom, not just confidence. Okay, what about the direct role of general trust in AI and an individual's self-confidence in their own abilities? How do those play into this dynamic?
The study confirmed that the more trusting an individual is of AI generally, across different applications, the more likely they are to rely on AI recommendations in specific tasks. Makes sense. Interestingly, though, For those with high general trust in AI, descriptions of extensive testing and training of the system significantly increased their reliance even further.
Ah, so telling them it was well-tested boosted trust even more for those already trusting.
Exactly. It suggests that once that initial barrier of general trust is overcome, specific indicators of competence, like rigorous development and validation, become crucial in fostering even deeper confidence. The general public, it seems, often holds different thresholds for error tolerance and expected performance for human versus AI systems, sometimes giving AI the benefit of the doubt, maybe more than it deserves.
So it's not just about what the system does, but also what we're told about how it was developed and tested. And what about self-confidence in one's own ability? How does that impact reliance on AI?
That's another vital piece of the puzzle. The study found that higher self-confidence, which they measured by participants' accuracy in practice rounds, correlated with less switching of answers to the AI suggestion. Conversely, those who performed poorly in the practice rounds were more likely to switch to the AI suggestion regardless of its accuracy. This highlights a dependency based on perceived self-competence.
So if you think you're bad at it, you lean on the AI more.
It seems so. And this aligns with other research, too. Low self-confidence can increase reliance on AI systems as a kind of crutch, while high self-confidence can paradoxically cause people to reject input from automated systems unfairly, maybe believing they know better even when they don't. It's all about calibrating that human belief in oneself with the machine's actual capabilities, finding that optimal balance.
The findings here are so nuanced. It's clearly not just AI good or AI bad, but how our human psychology profoundly interacts with it in these really complex ways. And what are the policy implications of this research specifically for national security?
This research is absolutely crucial for developing effective AI education and training programs for military personnel. The goal has to be to move individuals through that Dunning-Kruger curve towards balanced reliance, ensuring appropriate human judgment remains central, and to actively address automation bias. This directly supports commitments like the U.S. Political Declaration on Responsible Military Use of AI and Autonomy. Understanding these intricate human-AI teaming dynamics can significantly enhance the safety, effectiveness, and ethical deployment of these critical systems. Ultimately, it helps to prevent accidents and ensure responsible use in the most sensitive contexts imaginable.
We've explored the subtle ways automation bias works and where it's been studied. Now, let's talk about the very real, often catastrophic consequences when this bias isn't recognized or mitigated. These aren't just theoretical possibilities, are they? These are chilling reminders of the ultimate cost.
Not at all theoretical. These are stark reminders of the profound human and financial cost. In aviation, for instance, automation bias has been cited as a contributing factor in several real-world crashes, demonstrating the ultimate price of over-reliance. Think of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 back in 1972. The flight crew became so fixated on a burnt-out landing gear indicator light, a relatively minor issue, that they didn't notice the autopilot had inadvertently disengaged. They were so engrossed in troubleshooting the light that they failed to monitor the primary flight instruments, allowing the plane to slowly descend unnoticed into the Florida Everglades. Tragically, 101 people died.
Because they were focused on the wrong thing, trusting the automation implicitly.
Exactly. Their focus on the automated alert system, or maybe the lack thereof, blinded them to critical flight parameters. Another example, more recent, is Air France Flight 447 in 2009. While cruising over the Atlantic, the airspeed sensors temporarily froze up, causing the autopilot to disengage. The pilots, highly accustomed to automated flight, struggled to manually recover. They made incorrect control inputs that led to the plane stalling and plummeting into the ocean, killing all 228 people on board. Investigators cited a lack of manual flying skills and over-reliance on automation as contributing factors. It highlights how automation can potentially dull human intuition and preparedness for unexpected emergencies. These are truly heartbreaking examples of the cost in human lives.
Those are tragedies that resonate for decades, showing how quickly a small error compounded by bias can spiral. You also mentioned the Knight Capital incident in financial services earlier. That was almost immediate financial ruin for a company, all due to automation gone awry.
Exactly. The 2012 Knight Capital incident, where faulty automated trading software unleashed $440 million in bad trades in just 45 minutes, nearly bankrupting the company. It's a prime example of how quickly unchecked automation bias can lead to massive financial losses in a business context. Human operators, perhaps accustomed to the system's general reliability, either didn't detect the anomaly fast enough or maybe assumed the system would correct itself. They failed to intervene and shut down the runaway algorithm. It's not just about individual errors, but systemic vulnerabilities.
And it extends beyond financial and physical safety to fundamental issues of justice and public services, which can be equally devastating for individuals. The British Post Office Horizon scandal is truly horrific, isn't it? A real modern-day cautionary tale.
Here's where it gets really interesting and, frankly, truly horrifying, because it exposes a profound societal vulnerability to automation bias. The British Post Office Horizon scandal is a modern-day travesty of justice, pure and simple. From 1999 onwards, faulty accounting software called Horizon, used by the post office, repeatedly generated errors, creating phantom shortfalls in accounts. This led to the wrongful prosecution of over 700 innocent sub-postmasters for theft and false accounting.
700 people.
Based on faulty software. Yes. Despite contradictory evidence from the sub-postmasters themselves, despite their persistent claims of software glitches, and even despite internal warnings about the software's flaws, authorities and the legal system over-relied on the automated system's output. They essentially assumed the computer was infallible. This led to devastating human consequences. Lives ruined, people faced bankruptcies, wrongful imprisonments, and tragically, even several suicides were linked to the immense pressure. It's a stark, real-world example of institutional automation bias, leading to profound injustice on a massive scale, where the system's word was taken over human testimony and mounting evidence.
That is absolutely enraging. It highlights how a system can be deemed infallible when it's anything but, and human lives are just treated as collateral damage. And it's not just in the UK. Similar issues exist elsewhere, right? Like racial bias in justice systems in the US.
Precisely. A ProPublica investigation back in 2016 uncovered compelling evidence of machine bias in North Point's COMPASS system. COMPASS, that stands for Correctional Offender Management Profiling for Alternative Sanctions. It's an algorithm used in the U.S. justice system to assess a defendant's likelihood of reoffending. The investigation found that the system disproportionately misclassified black defendants as high risk, while a higher percentage of white defendants were mislabeled as low risk, even when their criminal records were similar.
So the algorithm itself was biased.
It appeared to be reflecting and perhaps amplifying existing societal biases. Both judges and parole officers relied on the system's automated risk assessments for sentencing and bail decisions, sometimes overriding their own judgment or available evidence. This is a clear case where biased algorithmic output, when uncritically accepted, overrode human judgment, contributing to systemic injustice and exacerbating existing racial disparities within the criminal justice system.
And bringing it back to healthcare for a moment, how can automation bias affect health equity? Could it actually worsen existing disparities for vulnerable populations?
Hasanzadeh and colleagues 2025 really highlight that automation bias in healthcare can profoundly worsen existing health inequities. If clinicians over-rely on flawed or biased AI predictions, it can lead to disparate care delivery or misdiagnoses, especially for vulnerable patient populations who may already face systemic disadvantages in accessing quality healthcare. This is particularly concerning given that bias, as they define it, is precisely that systematic and unfair difference in how predictions are generated for different patient populations that could lead to disparate care delivery. So, automation bias isn't just about an individual making a mistake. It can embed and amplify societal biases, leading to unequal and unfair health outcomes.
So the consequences are incredibly broad, touching our finances, our safety, our justice, and our health. Beyond these catastrophic examples, what are the broader, maybe more subtle dangers of over-reliance on automation that might not make headlines but still erode our capabilities over time?
Well, one of the most critical broader dangers is the potential dulling of human intuition and expertise. When individuals rely too heavily on automation, they tend to become less vigilant and less likely to critically assess complex or novel situations. This can lead to a gradual degradation of critical human skills over time. Think of it like our earlier analogy of a pilot who becomes so dependent on autopilot, they struggle to switch to manual control during an emergency. Prolonged reliance on automated systems can diminish our ability to perform tasks manually or without assistance, potentially leaving us unprepared to intervene effectively when necessary, especially during system failures or unexpected events, or when encountering truly novel scenarios that the AI simply hasn't been trained on.
It's like outsourcing our brains, and then those essential cognitive muscles start to atrophy. Makes sense.
Exactly. We also face the risk of misapplication of information. Automated systems can produce outputs that are highly technical, maybe difficult to interpret, or that require a nuanced contextual understanding that perhaps only a human can truly provide. Automation bias can lead users to accept these outputs without sufficient scrutiny, potentially misapplying that information in critical decision-making scenarios, sometimes with unforeseen and deeply negative consequences. It's not just about trusting the output, but interpreting it correctly and appropriately applying it to the specific context.
And I imagine this leads to a general sense of complacency in the operators, right? Where they just sort of assume everything is fine, the system's got it handled.
It absolutely does. Automation bias can dangerously cultivate complacency. Human operators might ignore or downplay system alerts, assuming the system will handle everything correctly, or maybe that a warning is just a false alarm. This can lead to a dangerous lack of active monitoring, where vigilance drops and they miss crucial deviations or errors that the system might be signaling, or perhaps that are not even within the system's detection capabilities. The human becomes more of a passive monitor rather than an active participant.
And there's a deeper systemic danger here too, isn't there? The idea that keeping a human in the loop is often seen as a sufficient safeguard for deploying imperfect automated systems, particularly with new AI.
That's a crucial point, and it's one that Green back in 2022 and Danelet in 2024 specifically highlight. If humans are susceptible to automation bias, then merely keeping a human in the loop offers a potentially false sense of security, legitimizing imperfect systems. It means we might deploy flawed automated systems into sensitive areas, falsely believing the human presence will catch all the errors. But if that human is prone to overreliance, this safeguard can actually lead to more bad decisions, or worse, allow systemic flaws to go unaddressed because humans are effectively covering for them or being swayed by them. This is especially problematic in the public sector, where citizens often have no choice but to use these services, and their fundamental rights or well-being might be at stake.
It's a dangerous kind of implicit endorsement of a system that might not actually be ready for prime time. And speaking of the public sector, you mentioned the black box problem earlier. Can you elaborate on that danger and why it's so critical for transparency and accountability?
Yes. Some advanced AI techniques, particularly deep learning models, create what are known as black boxes. Systems where the internal reasoning, or how a decision was reached, is unknown, opaque, or simply too complex for human interpretation. This poses a significant problem, particularly in the public sector, as it fundamentally hinders citizens' ability to appeal decisions. If you can't understand the rationale behind a negative decision about your welfare benefits, your eligibility for a program, or a legal ruling, you cannot effectively challenge it. This severely undermines accountability, due process, and the rule of law. The Swedish Diskrimineringsombudsmannen, their equality ombudsman, specifically flagged this in 2022 as a key concern, stating that systems must be transparent and understandable, especially when they affect fundamental rights. This lack of transparency can entrench power imbalances and make it nearly impossible for individuals to assert their rights.
Okay, so the dangers are clear and they are profound, touching everything from air travel safety to fundamental human rights. But this isn't just about identifying problems, it's about solutions. What can we actually do, both as individuals and maybe as a society, to guard against automation bias? What are the foundational strategies we should adopt?
Absolutely. And the good news is that there are multifaceted approaches we can take to mitigate automation bias. These encompass individual behavior, system design, organizational policy. It's a layered approach. First and foremost, maybe the simplest but hardest, is we need to cultivate skepticism. This means encouraging basic applied critical thinking skills, empowering individuals to question automated outputs when something doesn't make sense, or frankly, even when it does make sense, but the stakes are high. It's about fostering an environment where challenging the machine isn't seen as distrust, but as essential critical thinking and, due diligence.
So essentially, trust but verify, even with the smartest AI. What else can we do on an individual level, maybe?
Secondly, seek diverse human perspectives. When it's possible and appropriate, get a second opinion from another human. This isn't just about double-checking the machine. It's about exploring alternative interpretations of the data, or the situation that an algorithm might completely miss, or that might fall into an edge case the AI wasn't trained on. Different human minds bring different experiences, different cognitive pathways, and different ethical frameworks to a problem.
That's a great practical tip. And how do we design systems and processes to make this easier, to create a synergistic relationship rather than one of just passive reliance?
Well, we need to enhance human-machine collaboration. This involves designing processes that truly leverage the unique strengths of both humans and machines, ensuring that there's a built-in mechanism for critical evaluation of automated outputs rather than just allowing blind acceptance. It's about teaming,
not just passive acceptance. For instance, systems could be designed to specifically flag unusual outputs or outputs with low confidence scores for mandatory human review. And finally, a really powerful strategy for uncovering vulnerabilities is red teaming.
Red teaming, like in cybersecurity.
Exactly like that, but applied to AI bias and safety. This is where an independent team intentionally tries to find biases or vulnerabilities in an AI model. They test it under unique or edge conditions, like diverse demographic distributions or even adversarial attempts to fool the system. It asks the crucial question: how can organizations proactively implement this throughout their AI development and deployment lifecycle, making it a standard practice rather than just an afterthought?
That's fascinating. It's like having a dedicated devil's advocate for the AI, specifically designed to stress test its flaws and biases. Now, let's dig into what research has shown about specific factors that can mitigate this bias. You mentioned the timing of recommendations earlier. Does that play a role in how we design the interaction?
It does seem to, though the research isn't always conclusive across all contexts, as we saw in the public sector review. Some studies, like Agudo et al., 2024, suggest that receiving ADSS advice after a human has made their own initial assessment might be beneficial. The idea is to use the ADSS not as a primary decision maker, but perhaps as that second opinion or a signal to check the evidence again. However, as we discussed earlier, the same study also indicated that humans negatively impacted by incorrect automated support don't necessarily improve performance if they get correct automated support first. This suggests that an incorrect ADSS recommendation might anchor the human assessment regardless of the timing, making it harder to correct course. So it's not as simple as merely flipping the order in all cases.
Right, so it's not a magic bullet just to change the timing. What about transparency? Does telling users about a system's accuracy or even its potential for error actually help?
Yes, awareness of accuracy and errors does seem to have a measurable effect, although the outcome can be nuanced, as we saw with that Langer study. Informing users about a system's potential error rates can reduce automation bias. Research from Kupfer et al., 2023, and Langer et al., 2023, indicates that when users are made aware of potential errors, they tend to spend more time looking at provided information and perceive the system as more inconsistent. While this doesn't always guarantee improved decision accuracy in all cases, sometimes it makes them trust more. Weirdly, it does seem to improve the behavior that could lead to reduced automation bias, like fostering greater vigilance and scrutiny.
That's good to know, even with the counterintuitive results. But going back to that other surprising finding, simply telling people they're responsible for the decision doesn't work. It just seems like it should.
That's right, and it is a surprising finding that really challenges conventional wisdom. Studies, including Kupfer et al., 2023, and observations noted in Daneled's review, consistently suggest that simply telling users they are responsible for a decision doesn't necessarily reduce automation bias. While you'd intuitively assume this would make users more careful and diligent, the evidence suggests no such significant effect. This highlights that responsibility alone just isn't enough to counteract these deep-seated cognitive biases, like the tendency to offload mental effort or implicitly trust technology. It really points to the need for more active, systematic interventions rather than just reminders.
That really drives home how complex our interaction with these systems is. It seems like responsibility alone isn't sufficient to counteract those cognitive shortcuts. What about explainable AI, or XAI? It's meant to make AI more transparent by showing its reasoning, but does that always help with bias, or are there potential unintended consequences there too?
This is where it gets incredibly nuanced and complex, echoing that counterintuitive finding from the fraud detection research you mentioned. While explainable AI, XAI, aims to increase trust and adoption by showing how a decision was reached, some studies, like the Skimmer et al. Preprint, hint that it might in fact increase commissions errors.
By making people too trustful.
Exactly, by leading to less vigilance due to heightened trust. Sanzadeh et al., 2025, reinforces this, noting that XAI can sometimes give a false sense of interpretability, making users overconfident in a system they don't truly understand the depths of. For example, a visual explanation like a saliency map might highlight certain pixels in an image, implying they were key to a diagnosis. But this doesn't necessarily convey the AI's full reasoning or its limitations or potential biases. This raises a really important question. How do we balance transparency with appropriate skepticism? We want users to trust AI where it's reliable, but not blindly, especially when the explanations might be superficial or even misleadingly simple.
That's a huge challenge. If explaining it makes us trust it too much, what's the path forward? And you mentioned counter-arguing before. Does that show promise in fostering more critical thinking?
The potential of counter-arguing does show some promise, as it directly engages the human's critical faculties. Engaging users in counter-arguing, prompting them to actively agree or disagree with propositions and provide arguments for their stance, whether they align with the systems or not, appears to encourage more critical thinking and skepticism, potentially alleviating automation bias. Peters, 2022, found small indications that users spend more time looking at information when engaging in counter-arguing, though the results were tentative. It suggests that actively forcing engagement with the logic and requiring a human to articulate their own reasoning can help break that cycle of passive acceptance.
This all sounds like it requires a really systematic approach, not just isolated strategies or quick fixes here and there. Tell us about the concept of bias mitigation across the entire AI model lifecycle. That sounds comprehensive.
You're absolutely right. Hassanzadeh et al., 2025, really emphasize a holistic end-to-end approach to bias mitigation. They argue compellingly that bias isn't just a deployment problem. It can be introduced at every single stage of an AI model's lifecycle, from its initial conception all the way through to post-deployment surveillance. Therefore, effective mitigation requires systematic, proactive effort across all phases, ensuring continuous vigilance.
So it's not just about fixing the model at the end, but really baking in bias awareness from the very beginning. How does that start in the very first step, the conception phase?
It starts with bias surveillance from the moment the model is conceived. This demands a clear, clinically oriented research question in their healthcare context, but applicable elsewhere, and crucially involves a diverse AI development team. This team should include not just the technical experts like data scientists, but also domain experts, institutional stakeholders, ethicists, and critically members of the underrepresented populations whom the AI is intended to serve or might impact. The goal is to proactively identify and eliminate implicit, systemic, and confirmation biases right from the outset, ensuring the models are designed from the ground up to maximize fairness and equity, rather than just replicating or even amplifying existing disparities.
That's a fundamental step often overlooked, I think. And what happens next once the concept is clear in the data collection phase?
Here, the M is to generate datasets that best reflect the diversity of the population the model is intended to serve, because, as you know, the data an AI learns from is absolutely paramount. Strategies include using multiple, varied data sources to avoid single-source bias, engaging in open science practices to enhance transparency and allow for broader scrutiny, and carefully considering inclusion-exclusion criteria to ensure representation. This phase directly addresses representation bias, who is in the data, sampling bias, how data is collected, selection bias, which data is chosen, and measurement bias, how data is recorded. For example, historical medical data often has known biases or underrepresentation for minority groups, which can lead to skewed and unfair predictions in contemporary care if not addressed right here at the data collection stage.
That makes perfect sense. Garbage in, garbage out, as they always say. Then, once you have the data, what happens in the pre-processing phase?
This is where the raw data is meticulously cleaned and prepared for model development. Bias mitigation here involved careful management of missing data. Simply deleting records with missing data can introduce significant bias if data isn't missing randomly. It also involves selecting relevant variables carefully and using sophisticated feature engineering techniques to ensure data diversity and balanced subsamples for model validation. A critical example to guard against is aggregation and feature selection biases. For instance, using healthcare costs as a proxy for illness needs. This can unwittingly perpetuate racial bias, as seen in that famous Obermeyer et al. Study from 2019. They found that a widely used algorithm systematically predicted Black patients to have lower healthcare resource needs than white patients with the exact same level of illness.
Why?
Simply because the algorithm was trained to predict future healthcare costs, which are historically lower for Black patients due to systemic inequities in access to care, not because their health needs were lower. So the model replicated the bias in the underlying system, rather than reflecting the true health need.
That's a subtle but incredibly powerful way bias can creep in, even with seemingly objective data like costs. Wow. What about during the actual algorithm development and validation, the in-processing phase?
During in-processing, the focus shifts to anticipating and counteracting biased behavior within the algorithm itself. This involves rigorous techniques like stratified subgroup analyses, where you evaluate the model's performance specifically within different demographic groups to ensure fairness. It also involves using counterfactual examples, purposely altering sensitive features like ethnicity or socioeconomic status in test data to check for systematic bias in the output. Addressing class imbalance, where some groups are underrepresented in the training data, is crucial. Techniques like resampling, duplicating rare examples, or synthetic data generation, like SMOTE, synthetic minority oversampling technique, can help. SMOTE create artificial data points that resemble rare categories, making the dataset more balanced for training. Models should be evaluated using appropriate metrics beyond just overall accuracy, like F1 score, which balances precision and recall, useful for imbalanced datasets, and precision recall curves. Techniques like federated learning, adversarial training, and using inherently more explainable model architectures can also be employed here, though each have their own complexities and limitations. And red teaming, as we discussed, is invaluable during this development phase too.
So, constantly testing and retesting to ensure the algorithm isn't just accurate overall, but fair and robust across different groups, and even against deliberate attempts to exploit its flaws. And once it's deemed ready for the real world, what happens in the post-processing phase?
This is the clinical deployment phase, or deployment in whatever domain, where the model transitions from development to practical use. It involves implementing those human-in-the-loop (HITL) strategies, where human experts review and can override model predictions, especially for high-stakes decisions. Transparently disclosing the model's training population demographics is highly recommended, basically, declaring potential biases and limitations upfront to users. Explainability tools like saliency maps for image-based AI or SHAP values for traditional machine learning models can be utilized here to show which features were most influential in a decision. Though, again, Hassanzadeh et al. Caution these can sometimes give that false sense of interpretability, making users overconfident. Structured pre-deployment testing is also critical, including shadow deployment, where the model runs in parallel but its results don't influence real-time behavior. This allows assessment against human decisions to catch errors before full implementation.
And finally, it's not a one-and-done deal, is it? It needs continuous monitoring once it's out in the wild, interacting with new data and real users.
Exactly. The final phase is post-deployment surveillance. This is an ongoing process of continuous monitoring. You monitor user engagement, the impact of decisions made with AI assistance, and the model's accuracy against standard care or outcomes, purposefully linking this back to patient demographics or relevant subgroups. This is vital to identify emerging biases, especially things like concept drift, where the underlying relationship between data and outcomes changes over time, making the model less accurate, and feedback loop bias.
Feedback loop bias.
Yeah, that's where clinicians or users' acceptance of AI recommendations, even if those recommendations are subtly incorrect, inadvertently reinforces those mistakes in future training cycles if that feedback data is used. It creates a self-perpetuating error loop. So it's a never-ending cycle of vigilance, adaptation, and reevaluation to ensure the AI remains accurate, fair, and reliable over its entire lifespan.
That's an exhaustive and incredibly important life cycle. It sounds like this isn't just about technical fixes at various stages, but also about broad policy and design implications that govern how we interact with AI more generally.
Precisely. For policy and design, there are several key takeaways that are starting to emerge as best practices and even, in some cases, legal requirements. First, for high-risk AI systems, again, think healthcare, financial services, criminal justice, mandatory human involvement should probably be legally required for any fully automated decisions affecting individuals' fundamental rights, safety, or significant business outcomes. The human in the loop isn't just a nice-to-have, it should be a legally mandated safeguard in many cases.
Like the EU's approach to AI regulation, perhaps?
Exactly. Regulatory frameworks like the EU's AI Act, which began implementation in August 2024, categorize AI systems by risk. They impose stringent requirements for high-risk applications, including things like human oversight, extensive compliance documentation, and traceability. This provides a real-world example of how governments are trying to embed responsible AI principles into law, moving beyond just voluntary guidelines. Beyond regulation, continuous education and training are absolutely paramount for the human operators. This means fostering that healthy skepticism we talked about, helping people move through that Dunning-Kruger curve towards balanced reliance, and providing training that incorporates tracking errors and overrides to refine both human and machine performance over time. AI and machine learning concepts really should be integrated into professional training curricula, like medical education, legal training, etc., so future professionals are prepared for this new reality from the start.
So it's about upskilling humans to partner effectively with AI, not just automating their roles away or leaving them unprepared. And what about the data itself and the system's foundational design?
Data integrity and system design are fundamental pillars. There needs to be transparency and traceability throughout the entire AI lifecycle. This starts with establishing rigorous data quality standards, ensuring datasets are as free from bias as possible, complete and representative, and extends to comprehensive evaluation processes for algorithm design and deployment. This is really about building trust from the ground up, verifying that the AI is robust, fair, and accountable at every single stage.
And lastly, this might sound a bit paradoxical after everything we've said about mitigating bias, but is there such a thing as good bias when we're talking about AI?
That's an astute question, and yes, arguably there is. We should acknowledge that some bias can be intentionally implemented and designed into AI systems to support ethical standards, promote fairness, or meet legal requirements. For example, training AI to detect and actively remove hate speech from online platforms, or to flag potential fraud in financial systems where the goal is explicitly to protect consumers. These can be considered positive or good biases. This is about consciously aligning the AI's bias with our human values and societal good, ensuring the technology actively contributes to a more just and safe world, rather than just passively reflecting or amplifying existing inequities. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Wow. Okay. We have journeyed through the really complex, often hidden landscape of automation bias today, from its historical roots in aviation to its critical manifestations in our increasingly automated world. We've seen that while automation isn't inherently bad, in fact, it offers incredible benefits, our very human tendency to over-rely on it can have profound, even catastrophic consequences if it goes unchecked.
Yeah, and the prevalence of automation bias isn't always clear-cut across all domains. As that public sector review showed, it reveals a much more nuanced picture of human-AI interaction than maybe we first thought. But the risk, even at seemingly low levels, demands our unwavering attention. This is particularly true in domains that impact our daily lives so directly, like public services, healthcare, and national security. In these areas, the lack of choice for users or the incredibly high stakes just amplify the potential for harm and the erosion of accountability if we get it wrong.
But the good news, hopefully, is that understanding this bias, understanding its underlying causes, and the multifaceted mitigation strategies we've explored today, from cultivating healthy skepticism all the way to rigorous life cycle management, hopefully empowers you, the listener, to navigate this complex reality more effectively. You now have maybe some better tools to critically assess the information automated systems provide, and perhaps even to advocate for better, more responsible AI in your own contexts.
And looking ahead, as AI systems continue to evolve, becoming even more integrated and perhaps self-adaptive in ways we're only just beginning to grasp, what new, subtle forms of bias might emerge that we haven't even considered yet?
And maybe more importantly, how might we proactively design for a future where trust in automation is truly earned? Earned through proven reliability, genuine transparency, and a deep understanding of human-AI collaboration, rather than trust being simply assumed or passively given away. Something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.